I think we can get started a little bit. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Nang, and I am the comms director of Demand Progress, an organization that works across ideological lines to secure progressive policy wins through grassroots campaigns, leading smart lobbying and comms initiatives, and leveraging our staff's policy expertise. So last week, we released a poll of 1,200 registered voters designed to test the resonance of the abundance agenda. Our poll found that populist-aligned messaging consistently outperforms abundance-aligned messaging with Democrats and independents, and sometimes even with Republicans. Right now, today, as we speak, in DC, Welcome Fest is happening. It's kind of a Coachella for abundance proponents. So as they make their pitch throughout the day, we hope our poll and today's briefing can provide some important context about the effectiveness and resonance of the abundance message with actual voters. Joining me today is Dan Cohen, an advisor on this polling project and a strategist and pollster. He will walk through our poll, and then more importantly, he's just here to answer your questions about our poll and this project. So please, add those questions through Zoom. Anything you want to ask, we're kind of here to have a dialogue with you all. So I guess without further ado, I will hand it over to Dan.
Well, thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. Yeah, I'm gonna walk through as quickly but thoroughly as I can what the key results and takeaways were from the poll, and then happy to hear people's questions. So as I said, we started creating this poll um, sometime in like mid-April, and it was designed to test out again the resonance of the abundance agenda, especially uh, compared to relative to what most of us understand are the main tenets of a more populist economic agenda. Because the two frameworks are not actually mutually exclusive, one thing that we took great care to do was most of the question sections. In fact, there was only one question that put abundance up against um, populism and said choose. Most of it, it was just like, hey, do you like this idea? Does that resonate with you? Would that affect your vote? And what about this one? So we were able to look at, well, what people were most positively responding to overall. And additionally, was there overlap, and where did that overlap come from? Um, so the first part of the poll, where the importance of Democratic leaders to meaningful address the economic concerns of working middle class people um, really came out in our first two questions. A majority of our sample of registered voters said that government policy is generally harmful to working and middle class Americans, and only 32.7% said it was generally helpful. The majority was 52.2%. We also asked which party they had more confidence in to address such concerns. Democrats had a slight edge over Republicans, 38.3% to 36.7%, but 19.3% said neither. A slight plurality of independents, 32.0 said they had confidence in neither party. So obviously the urgency of having both the substance and the rhetoric of a good economic policy is really critical for Democrats at this juncture. When we asked respondents whether they strongly or somewhat agree or disagree with a series of statements about the economic well-being of working and middle-class Americans, the respondents most strongly agreed with the three populist framed statements. And I'm going to go through what some of those statements were. And again, these are just like statements about economics, about people's economic anxiety, and addressing the concerns of working middle class people. The one that had the most strongly agree a big problem is that the very wealthy do not pay their fair share of taxes. The working and middle class Americans need to shoulder too big a burden. That had 48.2% strongly agree, 19.9% somewhat agree, 10.8 somewhat disagree, 14.8 strongly disagree. That was the strongest of those statements that we tested based on the strongly agree. The next one was working and middle class Americans struggle because of inflation and stagnant wages. The government should do more to increase the minimum wage and ensure people can afford basic necessities. That had strongly agree, 47.6%, somewhat agree, 22.1, somewhat disagree, 12.4, strongly disagree, 12.1. The next strongest, corporations have too much power to increase prices as much as they can, and the government does far too little to prevent price gouging and collusion in important industries. 44.1% strongly agree. 28.4% somewhat agree. 13.3% somewhat disagree. And 6.1% strongly disagree. The top two abundance frameworks that we tested in that battery both tested far, far below those numbers. Um, the best testing abundance framework said bottlenecks that are caused by well-intentioned regulations are too often exploited by organized interest groups and community groups trying to help themselves, but not working in middle-class Americans. It's still tested as a net positive, but it's far lower than the populist framework questions. 27.4% strongly agree, 37.6% somewhat agree, 9.8 somewhat disagree, 4.0 strongly disagree. The other one in the abundance basket of these questions, excessive regulations by the government have made it too difficult for businesses to provide goods and services at affordable prices. 27.3% strongly agree, 27.4% somewhat agree, 20.1% somewhat disagree, 15% strongly disagree. So that was the initial way that we looked at it. And what's really important about this polling is you don't want to just ask like a one particular question in one way. To really make sure that you're tapping into something, we ask questions different ways. We ask if they agree. We ask how things might affect people's votes, and we're looking at the totality of all of the questions. In the next section, we had a long form, the abundance argument and the populist argument. And we asked if a candidate for Congress or president made that abundance argument or made that populist argument, how would that affect their vote? And then we asked, and I'll get to this in a moment, we asked which one of those frameworks do you agree with more, even if neither is exactly right? Um, so I'll just really quickly read the abundance one. The big problem is bottlenecks that make it harder to produce housing, expand energy production, or build new roads and bridges. Frequently, the bottlenecks take the form of well-intended regulations meant to give people a voice or to protect the environment, but these regulations are exploited by organized interest groups and community groups to slow things down. This increases costs and make it harder for us to provide everyone's needs. We need to push back against these groups so the government and economy can work better for working and middle class Americans. Overall, 12.6% of respondents said candidate making that argument, running for Congress or president, 12.6% said that would make them much more likely to vote for them. 30.9 said somewhat more likely. 16.6 said somewhat less likely. And 13.0 said much less likely. Among independents, critically, 12.5% said much more likely, 28.1% somewhat more likely, 18.3% somewhat less likely, 12.9% much less likely. So similar to the numbers in the aggregate. The populism one. The big problem is that big corporations have way too much power over the economy and our government. They work to prevent the government from making investments in things like expanding access to affordable clean energy, housing, and infrastructure improvements so that they can maximize their own profits. Corporations also try to raise prices by as much as they can, which is easier than ever because the economy is so concentrated in the hands of just a few people. We need to hold these corporations accountable and reduce their power so the government and the economy can work better for working and middle class Americans. The people who said that would make them much more likely was 26.3, more than double what the much more likely was on the abundance frame. It was 29.3%, somewhat more likely. Somewhat less likely was 12.0, much less likely, 12.2. So that was our long form question. And then after those, we asked, now that you heard more about both perspectives, which do you agree with the most, even if neither is exactly your belief? Overall, 29.2% said the abundance frame, 42.8% said the populist frame, 28% said unsure. So populism was clearly ahead in all of these frameworks so far, of abundance, but there was some uncertainty. Again, with the important independents, right? Because the numbers were disproportionately Democrats, but the independents were almost exactly the same, actually slightly a little bit better on the populist argument. 28.4% of independents favored the abundance argument, 44.3% said the populist argument. Um, we then tested the resonance of specific arguments a candidate for Congress or president might make without labeling them populist or abundance. And we included a synthesis in those breakdowns. Um, the the um, yeah, the populist one, the thing we need to do to make government and the economy do a better job of serving working and middle class Americans is to get money out of politics, break up corporate monopolies, and fight corruption. Overall, the much more likely to vote for someone with that argument was 48.5%. The somewhat more likely was 33.1%. Somewhat less likely, 5.8, much less likely, 2.6. The abundance argument, the thing we need to do to make government and the economy do a better job of serving working and middle class Americans is to reduce regulations that hold back the government and private sector from taking action. Much more likely, 18.8%. Somewhat more likely, 28.9%. Somewhat less likely, 18.3, much less likely, 15.5. And I will just point out that the populist framing in that argument was far more resonant with Democrats, very, very much with independents, and even Republicans slightly more agreed with the populist framing in that pair up than the abundance framing. When we asked the synthesis, where we literally just combined the two, we need to do that and that. Overall, much more likely, 37.6, somewhat more likely, 34.6, somewhat less likely, 9.7, much less likely, 3.8. So the synthesis tested lower than the populist framing to begin with. We can get into in dialogue after why that might be, but overall, the concentrated thing, if we are looking at what the voters are saying to us, what do they believe is the major challenge and for the economic well-being of working middle class Americans, they know what they believe. And just adding something else onto it isn't helping that. In fact, is watering it down a little bit. And then one thing we did at the end was, since there's broad agreement, in my view, and from the people that I've talked to in this project, that there are certainly regulations that are problematic, and anyone trying to make an economy work well is going to be concerned about those and want to take efforts to have a better functioning economy. But so we asked what people thought, who people thought were mainly responsible for those regulations. And so what we tested was, on the first hand, regulations that prevent the government from taking action to improve the lives of working and middle class Americans are usually in place because big corporations have influenced the government to protect their own interests. 39.2% strongly agreed with that, 35.9% somewhat agreed, 9.4 somewhat disagreed, 4.5 strongly disagreed. And then we tested the abundance argument. Regulations that prevent the government from taking action to improve the lives of working and middle class Americans are usually in place because organized interest groups and community groups. Only 15.9% strongly agreed with that. 35.8 somewhat, 17.8 somewhat disagreed, 9.9 strongly disagreed. So even when we get into the arguments that are a major core part of the abundance people, the voters overwhelmingly say, the false is largely in the hands of big corporations, and so they even land when entertaining the abundance agenda into the populist frame. So that was the main takeaways, from the polling. I think that we started out drafting it as because there was so much dialogue about the abundance agenda and a lot of arguments going around. And, it was realized that no one had been putting out data about like what do the actual voters in America think about this stuff. And if you're trying to strengthen a Democratic Party, as this debate is mainly within the Democratic Party, it seems really helpful to understand what the Democrats who are your base and the independents who you need to get a very good share of are concerned about. And this poll made that really clear.
That's all really interesting to hear. Um, Right now, I think we can just kick it open to questions. I have a few questions, Dan, that I want to ask you, but to anyone watching, please either submit questions through the Q&A function or raise your hand and we can unmute you to ask it live. We are here for a dialogue. And I know that people have a lot of strong feelings about this if our Twitter activity over the past week is any gauge of that. Um, Dan, I guess first I wanted to kind of ask you what was surprising about about the results to you, but also kind of what did you think when we first came to you about doing this, and did your did your view of doing this project change, I guess, after you saw the results or while you were doing it?
Oh, it definitely did. And this is, I think, one of the funniest parts of it when Demand Progress approached me. Mm, my first thought was because, and just to be clear, I'm someone who cares a lot about these issues, kind of, but the particular abundance debate that was going on, I wasn't following it at all. So it was kind of new to me. And just the idea of two economic theories, if you will, that are not mutually exclusive. As a pollster, we love answer choices to be mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. Being like everyone's going to have an answer that is the correct answer for them, and they only have one. And this is clearly not that. And so I was, to say the least, really grumbly about the whole thing. Uh, but as we put it together, that's what made me so adamant about making sure that we were testing something that allowed for a synthesis to emerge, to allow for people to be able to say, hey, both of those ideas are really important. And I want both of them to be part of the economic agenda and rhetoric of a party that I'm excited to support. And what was surprising was how clearly they don't want both of them. They are absolutely saying we understand the problem and we understand the elements of where the solution is going to come from. And that was clear cut, every way that we went about the questions, it was consistent throughout. So that was what stood out the most.
Yeah, that was a very common refrain that we at Demand Progress also noticed in terms of reaction. Um, a lot of people, and I get this instinct of saying that, why can't this shouldn't be a mutually exclusive thing. We should do both. These are not at odds with each other. Even Senator Chris Murphy expressed that sentiment that there shouldn't be a tension between abundance and populism, and that we should do both simultaneously. You've kind of already hit on this, but can you talk more about what the poll said about that approach?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this just goes back to when you want to have, a clear, well understood message in a political campaign or in a political movement. Uh, if you try to throw everything into it, it waters it down. And so the idea is what is the foremost thing? What is the centerpiece of what an effective economic agenda is going to be? And if you keep going, oh, and by the way, this, and by the way, this, you're going to water that down. And that's what the poll said. And that's the answer. Now, again, I want to be clear that there are elements on the policy side because a lot of the abundance people have been like, well, there's still policy things that we ought to do. Cool. Like, do those things. I don't think many people disagree with that. But the overall framework of what's going to speak to middle class and working class Americans about their economic anxieties and their economic situation, how they understand that those things are going to improve is completely within that populist framework.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. Just reminding the chat, please, if you have any questions, either raise your hands through the raise hand function or type it into the Q&A function. I have a few questions already. Dylan asks, do you think that abundance framing would poll better on any specific areas like housing?
So me saying what I think is kind of meaningless in the sense that we haven't tested that. But so my meaningless guess and thought on that is, yeah, I think if you drill down into particular policy areas and gave people some frameworks of things that would effectively shift the supply curve and get like more goods out there, lower price, I think that you could get some positive responses on those things. What's important to remember, at least for national politics, um, is that if that argument suddenly became the centerpiece of the Democrats' rhetoric, that would not be effective because it'd be taking away from what they understand to be the overarching reasons that they have the concerns that they have. But I'm sure if you dug into policy by policy, you'd find things that probably all of us would agree with too.
Yeah, yeah. Ezekiel asks, through your polling, have you gained any insights into the preferences of voters in specific swing states? I know you've talked about independent voters in general, but are there any indications suggesting that voters in a state like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania lean one way or another? So kind of like gauging the electoral presidential impact of this poll.
Right. So by separating out, looking at independent voters and stuff, that's what we could do with a national poll because the sample size in any particular swing state is going to be too low. But you raise a really important point, and one thing that I've been saying from the beginning of this is one poll, and it might be the first one that's gone out publicly, but there should be more research on this, and absolutely. Like someone should be polling specific swing states and seeing, you know, how the numbers are different in swing states and among particular swing voters within.
Um, just reminding the chat, please, add questions to the Q&A or raise your hand if you have anything. Dan, kind of rolling off of what you just said, are you aware of any polling on abundance out there besides ours?
Oh, no, unfortunately, because one of the first things that you want to do as a pollster when you're doing a poll on a relatively new subject is find out who else has been polling on it and look at the frameworks they use. So, we all kind of build off of each other's frameworks in that way. And I'm not aware of uh, any polling on abundance, at least that was made public. I've seen people allude to their, having had seen some data but nothing made it into the public realm.
Yeah, I think that matches what we've seen at Demand Progress. It is interesting, I guess I will say that, this abundance project, the book, the high profile media pieces, the groups, the just the whole rollout Welcome Fest, like there is so much institutional power and money behind all of this and planning. Um, I was actually surprised that we were the first to even do any kind of polling about, well, how do voters actually respond to this?
Yeah, no, it is surprising, perhaps, conspicuous in its absence on the other side.
I guess I would also just, to anyone watching, if, I ask around, like if there is polling on this, why haven't we heard about it? I like Dan is saying we've seen, on Twitter and elsewhere, people allude to seeing polling on abundance, but no hard numbers, nothing released. And that seems curious, I guess I will say diplomatically. Um, so also alluding to kind of the Twitter, well, I guess one more time again, well, not the last time, but if you have any questions, please add it to the chat or raise your hand. I also brought up kind of the Twitter drama, the reaction to all of our polls. There's been some pushback from abundance supporters on the wording in your poll. For example, the use of the phrase bottlenecks instead of, say, like red tape. Can you talk to us about how you came up with the language for the poll and what you think of that critique?
Um, I mean, I think any critique that comes up should be taken seriously. And I think, as I said, there needs to be future polling and you can try things, different ways. That said, we used the language that they used. We painstakingly, we took every effort to make sure we were giving a fair hearing to their ideas and used the language that they did. So that's the first thing. And the second part of it is, I read how long that framing was for the abundance idea and the populist idea. The middle section where we asked how it affect this. Changing a word which does not change the meaning of a framework question like that doesn't move the needle, like usually at all, because people understand what's being asked. And it's not like, oh, if they hear red tape instead of bottlenecks, suddenly their entire understanding of how the economy works alters. That's just not something that you're going to see. But I'm sure in the future people, can test different wording for those, and I'm confident that it won't change the outcomes. But I'd also love to see it.
Yeah, yeah. I yeah, that all makes sense to me. Um, Jesse asks, he wants to know basically if you have any sense of how this is resonating with congressional offices, particularly around the reconciliation fight, and if Hill offices are incorporating this in their messaging. I know you are more on the polling side of things, so uh, answer what you can, but also I think there is a deeper question too of like what this poll that you've created, how can policymakers, people in Congress use that to win, to make a convincing argument to the American people?
But well, I think in the first place, and that's why I started with how little confidence people have in government policy currently and how both of the parties are struggling to build confidence of the people. They ought to be taking it incredibly seriously. Um, I don't chat with these folks, so I have no answer whatsoever to if they're going, oh wow, we have to, significantly alter some stuff. But they ought to, because right now, too many of them are lacking the confidence of the American people, and the party is not saying in a meaningful way to middle and working class people, like we're the party that has your back. And that's a crisis for the Democrats. So as they try to figure stuff out, after the presidential election that we just had, and as they go into the midterms, and then 2028, the voters are saying very clearly what their concerns are and how they want them addressed, and so they should be listening.
Yep, yep. Touching back on the kind of Twitter pushback, well, I don't even want to dismiss it. Like like you were saying, like we really welcome, uh,
Yep.
criticism, constructive criticism, whatever. Like we are not here to attack anyone, but there's been this line I've seen of from the abundance camp about how this poll is unfair because abundance is a it's a policy agenda, not a messaging exercise. Can you kind of respond to that?
I mean, I think that's a legitimate argument for them to make currently. I think they've been making a lot more over the past week um, than previously, where those distinctions were quite often blurred. And and I don't want to get into what someone else's motivation was, but it really appeared that they were pushing for the abundance agenda to be the centerpiece of the Democratic Party's economic agenda. Separating that from messaging is uh, is kind of cute. Like you can't actually say we're going to run on things that are popular and then not do them. Because when you do that, well, you end up with the kind of numbers we saw in this poll, how little confidence people have in elected officials. So just saying, well, sure, say popular stuff, but then do this weird stuff people don't understand and not do that popular stuff is not a recipe for the growth or success of the Democratic Party.
Yep, definitely. I definitely agree with that. Um, Again, to anyone watching, if you have any questions, type it in the chat, raise your hand. We are here for you. Next question I'll ask is the Democrats' efforts in 2024 seem to be an attempt to target conservative and Republican voters that did not like Trump. Do you have any indication that the abundance framework would drive this specific group of voters to the Democrats in greater numbers than they were in 2024?
Um, just to make sure I'm understanding the question right. The question is that so that the anti-Trump Republicans uh who were targeted by the Democrats for this past election. Um, there's ways, I mean that's like that requires really digging into crosstabs and stuff that off the top of my head, I don't want to pretend I have an exact answer. Um, that's the kind of thing because we have all the crosstabs on, who people voted for before and after, and if they would, we got a whole bunch of things to look into. That is something that is that we could easily look at to the extent that I looked at people who were generally um more conservative but were not Trump people and stuff. Um this goes back to like they liked the abundance frameworks more than other groups, but it was a really small number. It's a small slice. Uh, if the Democrats decide that that small slice of people should define what the like what the rudder should be for messaging around economic issues, I mean that would be stupid. And I'm not saying, as some people do, that, oh, just run as left on everything that you can and things will work out. It's far more complicated than that. But it's such a narrow group of people, the kind of never Trump Republicans. Like that, and when you have vast numbers of people like the Democrats and independents who just told us overwhelmingly what they thought about economic policy, it would just be really foolish to abandon the base and the swing votes that you need, which also the swing voters who you're going to be able to sustain. Because if someone's a conservative Republican who just hates Trump, like you're not going to hold that voter even if you just get them for a second.
Yep, absolutely. Um, on that note, in the vein of what the poll means for electoral success, and you've discussed this a lot, to be honest, but I think it bears digging down a little bit more. Can you talk about what the poll says in terms of populist versus abundance messaging, reaching independent, moderate, and even conservative voters?
Yeah, I mean the thing that I spent most of the time looking at were the crosstabs around the independent voters and to some degree uh moderate voters. Um and as like when I walked through the stuff, that's why I read out, what the numbers were independents on most things. Um, the performance of the populist ideas among Democrats, it was overwhelmingly to the populist side, and that should surprise no one. That's these are like democratic, liberal, populist economic ideas. Of course, they're going through the roof. It's the strength of them relative to the abundance arguments with the independents and the moderates that really stands out because right uh, to have a party that can get aligned on something, you need most of the people within the party to kind of agree with it. And you also need that to be a winning message with the voters that you're competing for. And that's what this does. I'm not sure if I answered your question sufficiently there, though. Can you repeat the question if I didn't?
No, no, that is helpful and that makes sense. Yeah, I was just kind of starting a dialogue really about what how the both abundance and populism, uh, how resonant that they were with not just Democratic voters, but independent, moderate, and even Republican voters.
Right. And I mean the thing is, right? I mean, there's value in having an economic agenda or any agenda that doesn't unnecessarily antagonize the other side and mobilize their people. And but while we see that to the extent that there is an appetite for the abundance things kind of across the board, it is more on the Republican side. But even then, frequently we saw the populist ideas even more resonant with them than the abundance ones.
Yep, yep. Makes sense. I just want to do one last call for questions for anyone watching. Either put it in the Q&A or use the raise hand function. And while we're waiting, Dan, coming out of this project, and I kind of almost have to apologize for throwing you, Demand Progress, we've kind of thrown you into this world of abundance and populism and bottlenecks and corporate power. And there's obviously a lot of passion and attention behind it. Coming out of this poll, is are there anything is there anything you want to follow up on, or is there any did anything seem like, oh yeah, like there's an interesting thing that we should probe here?
I think, I mean, a couple things that have come up in the questions just here, I think are really important things to test. Testing the same kind of arguments within swing districts to see if there's a significant difference there. Um, that seems like an important thing to do. Uh, Breaking down different aspects of like more individual policy wise. So the question about housing, and also, I mean, just housing is an example of this. Understanding, like, well, what happens when you look at a local level for municipal politics or local politics? What happens if you look at a state level? Like this was focused on national politics across the country, and I think there's a lot of areas that would be really interesting to check into. But what's going to be important when that stuff comes up, because I don't expect anything's going to change the overall results because they were so stark. Um, we always want to keep inquiring and do, or polling and focus groups and stuff, and tweak things like those I mentioned before. There's aspects of what the abundance people would talk about, policy areas where I think there's very broad agreement on many of those. Well, how do you, if the overall agenda should be populist, then how do you reframe some of those to fit in seamlessly to the populist agenda? Especially important because when we tested a synthesis of the two, it tested less well than pure populism. So there's a number of things. It's always like there's no way to do the first public poll on subject matter and not be asking yourself a thousand other things that you would love to follow up with. And this is no different.
Yep, yep. I think we're almost reaching the end of our time today, but I just wanted to, well, first of all, thank you, Dan, for your time today, but also just for doing what I think is a real service. This whole populism for versus abundance thing, it can be very, or it can seem very high-minded, and a lot of elite media, elite political figures are fixated on it, but. I think that there are real stakes here. And, like you were saying earlier, the abundance camp is actively trying to make this the centerpiece of the Democratic Party, of their agenda. And right now, as we speak, I hear they're attacking our poll, but also just that they're trying to sell themselves as like people who have marinated in Washington, D.C. in elite circles in money and power their almost entire lives and careers. They're saying, oh, uh, listen to us. Our message is the one that will win back voters. And this poll, your work, it it actually has data. You talk to voters. You found clear evidence that actually it's populism that resonates with voters, and that this, kind of however you chop it up, this abundance argument is just flat out less popular.
Yep, that's correct.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And to everyone else that's watching, thank you for attending and for paying attention to this debate. If you have any questions for Dan or for Demand Progress, you can reach me at eric@demandprogress.org. And also, please check out more information about our poll also at demandprogress.org. We're also on Twitter and Blue Sky, where we're just Demand Progress, and we are constantly, talking about the poll and also our other work. So please reach out to us if you need anything. Thank you all, and I hope you have a great evening and rest of your week.
Thank you very much.